In JavaScript, there's a number of values which all behave in a similar way as false. That means that if we would use them in an if statement like this, or any other situation which would take a Boolean value, they're going to be evaluated as, or they're going to behave in the same way as false. So these values are called falsy, and of course that includes false. That also includes the number 0. That would also include an empty string. And then there's also undefined, there's null, and there's NaN, or not a number. These are all values that you can encounter while you're coding with JavaScript and that you might have encountered before. So I think the first 3 values are fairly straightforward, but I want to talk about what's the difference between undefined, null, and not a number. So first of all, what is undefined? Well, actually, undefined is a variable that you have declared or created, but haven't defined any value. So for example, let's say I would create the variable x. This x right now is undefined. And let's say that I would create a variable y, and that y can be any object. Now that y is, of course, not undefined, but let's say I would look for y.x or y.z or anything like that. This value is also undefined. Now, you might also see an error in JavaScript saying that something is undefined. What that can also mean is that it's not declared. So in an error message, the word undefined is not necessarily the same thing as the value undefined, which is a specific value which is given to variables that exist but just have never been defined. Okay, so that's what undefined is. What about null? Well, null is simply a value that you can assign to any variable, which means nothing, or this variable has no value. So when would you want to use this? Well, let's say that you would just create a new variable, and maybe it's the color of a player's hair, for example, and the player hasn't chosen that color yet, and you want to note that, you could initially set that color to be null. This is clearer than just leaving the value as undefined. And you'll come across a lot of places in JavaScript where null is used. For example, there's a function called document get element by ID, which searches through a page and it returns the element in the page with that ID. So if you would look for any ID which doesn't actually exist, the value of this is going to return null. We normally don't return undefined from a function. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So using null is a good way to return a value from a function when you want to say there's no result. And that's the difference between undefined and null. So now let's say we want to talk about not a number. Not a number is a value which results from an invalid calculation, an invalid math equation. So there's a lot of ways you could get something like this. You could take 0 divided by 0. You could also do something like the square root of -1. This will also return not a number, since JavaScript does not have a built-in way to deal with imaginary numbers. Another really common situation where you would get not a number would be if you would take something like a string that can't be converted into a number, and you would try and parse it into a number or convert it into a number. All of these are going to evaluate to not a number. So I want to go back to what I said at the beginning of this video, where I said that any value that is falsy, so any of these example values that I've given above, undefined, null, not a number, false, these are all going to cause this if statement to skip the first block and default to the second block because they evaluate as false. Now you can probably see here why a lot of people find JavaScript to be a very frustrating language, because I'm encouraged to write code like this. It's very short and simple. But by looking at the code, I don't know if someone else wrote it, maybe, if this X is expected to be a string, a number, maybe an undefined, maybe a null. I don't really know what the possible range of values that this variable could be. And that's why sometimes it's easy to write confusing code in JavaScript, and that's part of the way that the language developed over time. But yeah, it can be very confusing, even to people who are experienced. So how can we check for these values in a more clear and precise way? If we would say if X equals false, you'd think that that might be more clear. But there's a problem. This is the equality operator. And if we use the equality operator, actually the exact same thing is going to happen as in the first statement here, which is just fx. That's because the equality operator, when checking if something is false, will first convert the other value into a Boolean. So in this case, undefined, null, not a number, empty string, would all be deemed equivalent to false. So how we can get around that in JavaScript is with something called the identity operator. And the identity operator looks like this, with 3 equal signs. And if we want to check if x is really equal to the value of false, not just the evaluated Boolean, but it really is false, then we use 3 equal signs. And this is a lot clearer and can reduce the potential for bugs in your code. This will not be true, of course, for not a number, undefined, or an empty string. And so we also have the same thing is possible for an empty string. The same thing is possible for undefined. The same thing is possible for null. The same thing is possible for 0. Before I end this video, I'm going to leave you with one catch, and that catch is for not a number. The identity operator does not work with not a number. Let's not think about that too hard, why that is, but you can imagine that it has to do with the fact that not a number is really telling you what the variable isn't, and it's not really telling you what it is. So the correct way to check in JavaScript if a variable is not a number is to use the function number dot is not a number x. And this is going to return true if x is not a number and false if it isn't. When I first started learning JavaScript, I found all of these different values to be really confusing. And even today, I really need to think about it sometimes when I'm working with them. So I hope this will help to clear some things up for you.